right. We did Shalom for my body yesterday, kind of impromptu. So we thought we'd do it again. We have just 3 minutes and then David will be up. So I think most of you know how to do it. If you feel embarrassed, feel free to turn off your camera. And we're just going to start with infant startle. So you and lean back. Remember, you're leaning, don't just do your head, do your whole body. If you're in a chair like mine, you can actually tip your chair back. So here we go. Deep breath in, chanting, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. We'll do this 3 more times. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I'm afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Okay, now yawning, breathing in as you yawn. And chanting, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. We're turning our heads, so just so you're not looking down my throat. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I'm afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Right now, tapping on our vagus nerve, you're just curling your fingers like you're playing the piano and you're tapping firmly on your chest. Your vagus nerve is in that area. So you're tapping, breathing in, then massaging as you exhale, and chant, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Tap. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you, O Lord. And now I would like to introduce David Takle, who is on my board of directors and has become, he and his wife Jan have become very dear friends of ours. And we met David, I think it was back in 2011-12 when we did this book, Forming, which has turned out to be kind of the Healing Center favorite workbook class that we want everyone to take. But David is a prolific writer and he's written a score of books, including this 400-page version of Forming. And he always has so much wisdom. He has a new book that's just come out that I haven't had an opportunity to read yet. And you guys are in for a real treat to hear from David today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. The new book actually isn't out yet, but if you watch Humble Shack bookstore, it'll be there about 6 weeks before Amazon. So you might want to get an early copy, probably the middle of September. All right. Let me see if I can get the slide up here. There we go. How's that? All right. Barriers to living in joyful confidence. You know, I almost named this Enemies to Joyful Confidence. We're in kind of a battle for this. Today we looked at Paul's experience of adversity and tried to draw from that a few critical areas that foster living in joyful confidence. And our hope in this session today is to identify some of the biggest problems that diminish our joyful confidence. And that will help us out so that when we lose our joy, we can recover it more quickly and use our energy wisely in fighting the right fights. The first thing, of course, is knowing who our real enemies are. We're all familiar with this verse in Ephesians. Our struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. See, the thing is, when we experience the loss of joy, whenever we think about what destroys our joy, what often comes to mind is, that hateful relative, the polarized politics, maybe it's our boss or a coworker, a pandemic, personal health issues, financial setbacks. And we seem to think these are the enemies that rob us of joy. But I think our real enemies are unseen. And there are a great many of them. So while Paul is correctly pointing out the spiritual forces that seek to destroy our life, these forces don't always come at us real directly. They often use a kind of an indirect process. And that's partly why we miss what's going on. And we want to focus on what I would think is 3 of their most common tools. And these are spiritual forces that the strategies that they use to derail us. And at the top of the list is fear. Number 1. More and more, I am convinced that our number 1 enemy is fear. See, when we're in the middle of a pandemic or something's happening at work that's a little scary, we think that's the big problem. But the enemy is not the person or the situation. Our big enemy is our fear of the person or the situation. And that distinction is important. Because there's almost no area of our mind that escapes the effects of fear. It can erase our joy and peace. It interferes with our discernment. It even distorts what we can see. It impairs our rational mind. And it constricts our relational abilities. And actually prepares us for attack and withdrawal instead of being relational. But most importantly, I think, fear is diametrically opposed to trust. And I think this is extremely important because if you think about it, trust is the basis for our bonded relationship with God. And it's our relationship with God that's the basis for living in joyful confidence. So we have to deal with fear and anxiety. Now, the New Testament has a lot to say about not being anxious or afraid. And I think the real message behind these statements about not being afraid is that the authors understand the power of trust and the necessity of trust. We have to trust God with our very life. Now, sometimes the authors actually use the word trust, but more often they use, there's a phrase that they use. They say, I want you to believe in. So when Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled, believe in God, believe also in me, in effect, he's saying, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust me. Trust the Father. So every time you see this phrase, believe in, think trust. And he's not giving us a command like, don't do that. Don't be afraid. What he's saying is, trust and fear are in opposition to each other. And so trust me, and that will diminish your fear. Because as fear increases, it displaces our trust. And as trust increases, it will displace our fear. And we can also see how this relates to what we talked yesterday about focus and what we see as important. Because if we ruminate on the world, if we ruminate on life's problems, that just feeds our fears. But if we keep our eyes on God and pay attention to what He's doing, and our trust will grow. Um, and fear is not only diametrically opposed to trust, it's opposed to our peace. Jesus told his disciples, my peace I give to you, peace I leave with you. I don't give as the world gives, and don't let your hearts be troubled. So he's putting peace and fear in opposition to each other. And last of all, fear is diminished by love, by our secure relationship with God. John tells us in 1 John 4, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And again, I think trust is related here because perfect love generates trust, and together these push fear out of our life. We see it even as far back as Psalm 23, that if I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. So it's that relationship that can push fear out. Now, there's a lot to say about fear, but we just want to point out that I think it's the number one enemy of joy and confidence. And as we said, the antidotes are deeper trust, stronger bond with God, living in His peace. In a word, dealing with fear is all about relationship with God, and not nearly as much about trying to deal with the thing that we're afraid of. Number 2 enemy, powerlessness. How many felt powerless during COVID? How many felt powerless during the election? I mean, we feel this all the time when the world is going crazy. It's like, how do we stop this? See, the second great enemy we feel is this feeling of powerlessness, and one of the reasons this is so crucial is that powerlessness can lead us to hopelessness and hopeless despair. And nothing can, hopelessness will rob us of joy, and it will rob us of confidence in God. And here's the thing now, and we need to really get this. God never meant for us to worry about powerlessness. He made us small, and He did that on purpose so that we would be dependent on Him. Now, Paul addresses powerlessness in many places. Here's one of them. And notice that this is right in the middle of this 2 Corinthians, where he's talking about this litany of things that have happened to him that we talked about yesterday. But right in the middle of that, he says, we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. You see, we get through difficult circumstances not by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps or through gritting our teeth and, pushing through it. We rely on, that's relying on our power. And Paul says, we're small, we're clay jars. We don't have the power to do what we need to do. And this is really important, and a lot of people today, this may jar a few people's theology. A lot of people today talk about ministering in power and authority. And I want to caution you, be very careful about that and be careful what we mean by that. I think people often try to appropriate way more authority and power than they really have. If you look up power in your concordance, nearly every reference says the power belongs to God and not us. Many of these references are very explicit, like this one. This extraordinary power belongs to God. It does not come from us. Paul says in Ephesians 6, when he's talking about warfare, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his power. In 2 Peter 1, Peter says, his divine power has given us everything needed for life and godliness. We need to be careful how we think about power, because I'm telling you, God made us small for a reason. And when Paul was at his very weakest, again, back in 2 Corinthians, this time chapter 12, when Paul was at his lowest point, God told him, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And so Paul's response was, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. See, we need to always locate power in the hands of God. And in fact, I love this idea, because Jesus is actually telling Paul, my power and your powerlessness fit together perfectly. You need to let that sink in. My power and your powerlessness fit together perfectly. Because this leads us to acknowledging our real size that we talked about yesterday. We are small creatures with a big God, and we were never meant to anguish over powerlessness. That just leads to diminishing our trust, or worse. We're meant to trust God himself to be with us, to work in us, and to work for us, and to handle everything that we can't do. And the enemy will use feelings of powerlessness to beat us down and rob us of our joy. And here's a third issue. And especially a cloudy view of who God is, or a distorted view of who God is. Betsy talked about this yesterday. I think Dallas Willard one time said, one of the single most important things in your life is what you think about when you imagine God, who you imagine him to be. And that, if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense, because if God created us for relationship with him, then how we view God is very central to what kind of relationship we can have. It's one of the most important things about us. And unfortunately today, much of the Christian world sees God as the great arbiter of law. He's the great lawgiver and the great judge of how the law is kept. And if that's your number one view of God, then that creates a real problem. How do you have a relationship with a judge? That's a whole nother topic. But a great enemy is a distorted view of how God works in our life. Is he active? Does he care? Is he involved? What is God's place in hard circumstances? We have to be very clear in our vision about this, because if we're not clear, it can destroy our joy and confidence. Because here's the thing, our life in the unseen realm will follow our vision. It can't be any other way. Jesus himself says so. And that's what this verse is about. Your eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is healthy, your whole body is full of light. But if it is not healthy, your body is full of darkness. You see, your life will follow your vision. And we could probably do a whole retreat on vision. This is a huge topic. It covers a very broad spectrum of things, from our image of God to our entire worldview and how we perceive ultimate reality. But at the very top of the list, how we see God's character, how we see his gaze toward us, how we see his intentions toward us, how we understand his availability to us. We need to be sure that our vision is clear in all of these areas. See what a lot of people do when circumstances go bad is we just double down on our efforts. But see, being more dedicated is not our first line of defense. Because if you have a faulty vision, the more dedicated you are to a faulty vision, the worse it will be for you. So dedication alone is not the answer. A cloudy vision will destroy our joy. It'll destroy our confidence in God. And it doesn't matter how hard you try. We need to continually check in with God, check in with others to make sure what we're seeing is true and it's good. All right. So we've got fear, powerlessness, and cloudy vision. I think these three are certainly the most common enemies of joy. And these, our spiritual enemy will make use of these the best that he can. Now, the good news in all of this is we don't have to fight these enemies with our wits or our best efforts. Paul says the weapons of our warfare are not human. They are divine, and they have the power to destroy strongholds. And once again, this is in 2 Corinthians. I want you to get a vision of how powerful this book is in terms of life in a broken planet. This is a theme throughout the book. But see, we need to identify our real enemies and join with God, especially when we are encountering fear and powerlessness and our impaired vision. And these are just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. The enemy has a whole array of tools. Getting us to ruminate on evil is a way. Getting us to neglect our soul care is a tool. Get us to overextend and burn out, another tool. Getting us to stop our recovery process. All right. If we think we've arrived and we've done enough work to just put that aside, big mistake. We can't stop our recovery process. The restoration is lifelong. See, there's a whole suite of tools, and we need God for this battle. Take every one of these things back to God. So look, here's another wall in my way. Here's another brick that hit me in the head. You've got to help me with this. And even though the power belongs to God, that does not mean we're passive in this war. There's all kinds of things that we can do to practice with God and sharpen the weapons that God has given us. All right. Simple things like, number one, quality time with God, abiding with God, because it's this relationship and the strength of that bond is our best defense against these things that we're talking about. Spending tremendous amounts of time just in appreciation, in awe and wonder at who God is. I think sometimes we focus on the conversational prayer with God in our spiritual disciplines. But I want you to consider the power of silent prayer, just being with God and noticing him and being in awe of him. Powerful stuff. It builds that strength of that attachment bond. And the third thing I want to suggest is a dedication to personal examination. We have to stop and look and notice when we're afraid, when we're feeling, when we can't see right, when we can't, like, we don't know what the next step is. We're having trouble seeing God. We're having trouble seeing how he's involved. We need to keep noticing where we are on the journey, what today is looking like, what I'm experiencing right now in the moment. And of course, we need to learn how to do this personal examination with God and without getting self-absorbed. So there's some balance here. But this is where we come to our exercise for today. And what we want to do, this is page 54 in your workbook. The goal of this exercise is to talk to God about some barrier that you're running into, some enemy of your joy and your confidence, and to then begin the process of removing this barrier or releasing it to God. And I love, this is where Psalm 139, every time I read this psalm, it's like standing in the spotlight. God is doing an examination of my heart. And it's just the psalmist says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Examine me and know my thoughts, and see if there's any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." And once again, I would encourage you to just take this slowly, read through the intention, and stop at each one of these for a minute and write out some thoughts. What's your intention for this time with God? Appreciation. What do you appreciate about being able to bring this to God? Receptivity, your reception. Ask God to open your heart to see and to hear. Then connection. Strengthen that your awareness of the presence of God, and that he's there to mentor you and heal you. And then enter into the time of reflection. Reread Paul's prayer, and then think about where am I in terms of my focus, my vision, anxiety level, feelings of powerlessness or hopelessness. How am I doing on soul care? And just see what Lord God, just ask God to reveal what kinds of things are in the way. What do I stumble over? What keeps pulling me down? And spend some time with him, identifying the barriers that you face. Now, what we're going to do with this exercise, we go until 9:30, and then there's a break. There will not be a small group discussion about this. So you have about a half an hour for your reflection and conversation with God. And then there'll be a break time at 9:30, if I remember or 10:30. I'm sorry. I've got my clock wrong. 10:30. A break, and then 9:45 we reconvene for a session with Frank. So at this point, I would just encourage you to turn your video and audio off and see what God has for you.